everyone for coming today. So we're talking about a very interesting book, the best of, I think, the three Scruton books, certainly the most accessible. We're dealing with a philosopher who is also a trained musician. Roger composed music. He was an accomplished pianist. He listened to music at home more avidly. He didn't really go to the theater so much, and he did occasionally. But if you read his other book, which I happen to have here, Gentle Regrets, a memoir, he had a very difficult financial life for much of the time and found it prohibitively expensive to go to the theater. And he was also very disappointed by what he saw. You all certainly know that Roger was a traditionalist. And when he saw kind of crazy new productions or productions that didn't give a literal depiction of what the work wanted to be, and this is especially true in Wagner, if you follow Wagner productions, he would be very disappointed. So he's coming at it as a very traditional but still trained musician. And of course, he's writing about Wagner, who was a great musician, but also the most philosophical of all composers. So we have this nexus of philosophy and music that Roger's exploring in great detail in this book. And that actually creates one of our problems. I think today's reading is a little bit awkward and a little bit disjointed because we have his short introduction about what he tells us he wants to do. And what he's most interested in is getting at the work itself and talking about why it is still important, still revered, still, to use a term that millennials usually use or overuse, relatable. I hate hearing that word, but they use it all the time. How is it relatable to our lives today? The problem with that is that he introduces this idea and says, well, I'm not going to write or dwell at any great length on the philosophical dimensions of the ring. Then, of course, he writes a first chapter about what? The philosophical dimensions of the ring, right? It goes on for like 40 pages about the influences on Wagner. That's all very familiar. If you've studied Wagner at any length, you'll have been aware of the role of Schopenhauer and Fichte and Hegel and these other different German philosophers of the 19th century, and also have a sense of the literary sources that Wagner used and harmonized for the ring. I'll talk about that sort of briefly because that is very familiar work. People have written entire books called with titles literally like Wagner and Philosophy or The Theology of the Ring. These are all out there, and if you've got any familiarity with it, this will help guide you. I happen to agree with Wagner's Scruton's original approach. I don't think you need a philosophical discussion or a particularly strong intermediary to understand what Wagner's talking about or what he's trying to get at. It's my own idea, if I ever have time to write again, to do a Wagner book in which we just look at concepts and ways you can deal with this. And I think actually Michael Weaver had this comment earlier in his introduction. One of his grandfather's friends said to him, you know, once you learn about the harshness and disappointments of life, you'll learn to love Wagner. And I think that's really what Wagner is about. I'll say this as a sort of disclaimer. Roger thinks you can derive positive messages from the Ring of the Nibelung. He and I violently disagreed about that. I think if you derive positive messages from the Ring of the Nibelung, you should probably talk to a psychiatrist. I think the strength of the Ring of the Nibelung is to tell you how to deal with adversity, how to deal with base instincts, how to deal with this tension between what we're supposed to be and what we really are. And in our subsequent talks, we'll get into that in more detail. So I would like to start by talking about the introduction. I think that's going to give us some very good signposts about where we're going to go with this. And on the very first page, Roger introduces one of the central problems of Wagner. In order to appreciate his work, you have to get past the man. Almost everything we think about when we talk about Wagner's music, if you mention it in a conversation to the wrong person, if you bring it up in the wrong context, you can be called an anti-Semite or a defender of Nazism or a defender of German racism. This is largely unimportant, in my opinion. We need to understand the context. I think that's true. And Roger would certainly agree. He wrote a whole chapter about it. But as you go forward looking at this, you've got to realize, first of all, that in the 19th century cultural universe in Europe, virtually everyone was anti-Semitic. And if you go through their writings and try and find offensive passages, they are there. And all you need to do to confirm this, just look at what we've done in our own country in the United States to Mark Twain in the last 6 months. Right? Is being taken out of school curricula. It's an absurd travesty because he said things 150 years ago that we don't like today. With Wagner, it's very much the same thing. And what's interesting, especially in the past few years, that sense of Wagner as a kind of radioactive personality, a composer whose expressions of thought, whose derogatory comments about Jews are unacceptable and beyond the pale, that this is actually rather faded. It's no longer in step with the kind of ideologies that have taken over in the past few years. There's nothing in Wagner that suggests anti-Black racism, and there's no accusation against him as such. There's nothing in the Me Too movement that was particularly upset about Wagner. This was an older trope. And as you see the more recent writings, and I'm thinking particularly of Alex Ross's, from the New Yorker's, new book, it's called Wagnerism. And this is like this 800-page sprawling monster of a book tracing Wagnerian influences throughout human history. When he gets to the Third Reich chapter, when he talks about Wagner and Nazism, he relays what I think is actually a very correct message, that it really wasn't that big of a deal. And in fact, that's one of the first mistakes in Roger's book. On the first page, he talks about Wagner as Hitler's favorite composer. This isn't even true. Hitler's favorite composer was Bruckner. That's not even in dispute. That's in Mein Kampf. Certainly he liked Wagner, but the idea that he was his favorite composer is a canard. And within the rest of the Nazi leadership, very few of them, Joseph Goebbels perhaps, but most of the rest of them didn't actually care much for Wagner. They felt like they had to go to performances almost out of command. And it didn't play a significant role in the development of the ideology. But we've conflated this into something so monstrous that it's hard to unpack and deal with. I think it's correct what Roger says in his introduction, to deal with it very much on its own terms, to look at it in terms of what you want to see in the work, and that the work itself shouldn't be necessarily about the man. If I painted a picture of the beautiful view to my left here, wouldn't you be more interested in the picture than what it says about me? I hope you would. And in the same way, you can do this with the Ring of the Nibelung. You can reduce it to its concepts and messages, to what, I'm going to use that ugly millennial word again, to what you find relatable in it. And clearly we all do. We're sitting here now nearly 150 years after its premiere, talking about it on Zoom in technology that Wagner never could have conceived of, from all parts of the world at great length, in the old Anna Russell line, at those prices, that really still means something to us. And I would even venture to say, I don't have precise figures, that we live in a renaissance of Wagnerian performance. There is more Wagner being performed now than at any other time in history, including in his own lifetime, when many of his works went for years without being performed. I was bragging before about having seen the Ring of the Nibelung 17 times. How many times did Wagner see the Ring of the Nibelung? 3. He had 3 at his first festival. It was never performed again in his lifetime, and then he died. And that was that. So we live in this renaissance of Wagnerian performance. David Robinson and I can debate the merits of the current singers. I love some of the old singers just as he does. But nevertheless, we're seeing more performance now than ever before. It's an interesting thing I would talk about with my students, because when I was growing up in the 1980s, our mythologies were much more oriented toward the future. It was Star Wars and Star Trek. Now, and for reasons that I don't quite know, I can't venture an explanation, a coherent explanation of why, we're tending to look more back at medieval lore and ideology, with Game of Thrones, with Lord of the Rings. This is what the kids are really interested in now. And that creates its own sort of problems. We'll get into that as I talk more about the sources of the ring cycle. But this was something that Sir Roger was very, very concerned with. It's like, how do we get into this relatability? For me, it's like, what idiom do you use? Do you use future or past? Ultimately, it might not be important, because as Roger points out, This is fundamentally about myth, and his belief, if you go on into that first chapter, is that myth radiates truth, right? Maybe not literal truth, but truths about what it means to be human, truths about our condition, truths about the moral choices we face in our lives, truths about how we understand and interact with the world. What's interesting here, and again, this is very well discussed in his source material, is that in the generation before Wagner's birth, and Wagner, remember, was born in 1813, in that very traditional culture of Europe, they were beginning to look around in the place of sort of theology and religious guidance in their lives at other cultures that they were encountering in the age of exploration and trying to find commonalities. And it's at that point that you see linguistic analyses, which, for example, link Sanskrit to European languages. They're all European, Indo-European languages. So for that reason, it seems like that there are commonalities. And they also start to look at the different myths and legends of foreign societies. Now, what they did not know at that time, and I'm not even sure Roger knew this book was published in 2015, our current linguistic analyses in only the past couple of years show that all the fairy tales we learned as children are in fact thousands of years old. They transcend these different cultures and differentiations of peoples. And in that period of time, that time frame just shows that these legends last a really long time. Now, it's within Wagner's lifetime, in the 1820s and 1830s, that we start to have the codification of the German versions of these myths in the work of the brothers Grimm and in other people's ideas. And Wagner starts to look at them as inspiration. We'll talk about the philosophical basis, I think, later. Roger does this in reverse, but I think it's useful to talk about the mythological sources first. What Wagner did in The Ring of the Nibelung was harmonize a whole lot of German and Norse mythology, particularly Danish and Icelandic mythology, left over from the Middle Ages. There were both prose sources, the prose Edda, we call it, and poetry, the poetic Edda, that get harmonized into different myths. And what Wagner did was he looked into these different sources, took out the messages and the characters that he particularly needed to convey the points he wanted to convey, and put them together as a coherent story. If you read Roger's book and also really any other companions of The Ring, you'll know that he wrote the story in reverse. Roughly the plot of Götterdämmerung, the final opera in the series, was meant to be the only work that he would do on the topic. This would be the tale of the life of Siegfried, right, who was a bold hero at a time when heroes were very much valued as an archetype, and his betrayal and eventual death. Most of that story comes from a German source called the Nibelungenlied, or the Song of the Nibelung. Why do we call it a song? If you look at the old epic poems, not just the German ones, but also the Odyssey and the Iliad from ancient Greece, epic poetry was meant to be sung to you. Why would we do that? Why do we call The Lord of the Rings, by the way, a song of fire and ice? Right, same idea. It was meant to be sung because it was composed in poetic meter, and also because if I sing something to you, your chances of remembering it are a lot better. And in pre-literate cultures particularly, if you can't read or write, you need to remember those stories if you're going to pass them on to other people, to a new generation. So the idea, the idiom of song becomes very, very important in this. So the Song of the Nibelung, this metrical poem from 13th century Germany, forms the basis of Götterdämmerung. But having looked at that, Wagner needs an explanation. Well, if we talk about Siegfried's maturity and betrayal and death, we need to talk about what came before that. So then he starts thinking about it more and more, and he says, well, what we really need is a kind of prequel opera, something that describes the events that comes before. And he gave it the title Der junge Siegfried, or the Young Siegfried. We know it within the context of The Ring of the Nibelung as the third opera in the cycle, simply Siegfried. And then he gets into this other problem, which I think is common to many novelists, to people who have problems setting out narratives. how do you explain the precursor events to Siegfried's youth and life? And for this, you need an explanation of his parentage and of the divine or semi-divine origins of that parentage. And then before that, you need also the creation of the world. So you end up with 4 operas composed in a particular order, right? The poems go backwards in time. The music was actually composed forward. He started composing with Das Rheingold, which I hope you are all able to watch before the session today, and continued through Götterdämmerung. But the idea is to tell the story, a much larger story than what he originally set out to do. Originally, it's the life of Siegfried, the great Germanic Norse hero. Eventually, it becomes a complete sort of universe, a universal description of the creation and destruction of the world. That's a fascinating point because within the Norse mythology, there is no precedent for that. There is nothing in the Norse mythology that deals with creation myths or with millenarian destruction myths. There's no creation and destruction of the universe. You simply have these characters who function within it and reveal the various mythological points that Wagner wanted to make, but there's no sense of creation and destruction. That first scene you see in Das Rheingold, in fact, has no basis in mythological lore. It just does not exist within that tradition. That's a scene completely created by Wagner. The idea that you would have a base being, and we can talk about superiority and inferiority in a few minutes, but Alberich, who forswears love, is a base being. The idea that you would have such a creature in nature who would forswear love in order to gain power, this is a mythological conception that Wagner himself created. And I think when we're looking at the Ring of the Nibelung, I really wish Roger had talked more about this. He does have a paragraph where he talks about Wagner creating a new myth and a new sense of mythology. But the Ring of the Nibelung, in fact, gives us a new mythology back at which we can look. If you look at the later influences of the Ring in culture, politics, and society, they're enormous. You could do an entire book just about that. I'll restrict myself to one particular idiom, the idea of being stabbed in the back. You know that Siegfried's murder in Götterdämmerung is the result of betrayal. He is literally stabbed in the back by another inferior being, by Alberich's son Hagen, who distracts him at a moment and treacherously kills him. At the end of the First World War, when the Germans were losing and decided that they needed to surrender to form an armistice with the Western Allies, they stopped the war. The political and military leadership that did this later created a legend, a myth, if you will, that they had been stabbed in the back. Not defeated in the field, but stabbed in the back by domestic politicians, by the political left in Germany, by the Jews, by whoever they didn't like. And that phrase, stab in the back, comes largely from that. I worked in academia for 15 years. I could tell you all about stabbing people in the back. I'm getting some thumbs up there. But definitely that's where we get that expression. Nobody ever talked about that or used those words before Wagner. So that's a way in which it's radiated into our own mythology. Also, in understanding the world, right? This is a very new creation. I think something Roger gets rather wrong in that first chapter is the idea that this new popularity of myth and mythology was in some way of wide appeal to the Germans. You do see some precursors of Wagner's work. The forgotten German composer Heinrich Dorn, for example, actually composed an opera called Das Nibelungenlied, right? The Ring of the Nibelung song. We don't know much about it. It's never performed anymore, but this predates Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung. We have other writers working at that time who were drafting sort of new conceptions of drama and poetry going back to those mythologies. But by and large, if you look at the reading habits of kind of like bourgeois urban Germans in the 1840s and 1850s, they weren't so concerned with mythology. They were very much swept up in the Romanticism of Germany and also of other countries. Probably the most popular author in Europe was Edward Bulwer-Lytton, at that time, who actually wrote the inspiration for Wagner's Rienzi, right? His early work that Wagner didn't like and thought should never be performed again. It's not considered to be among his mature works, but that romantic spirit really only manifested in those kind of 19th century big novels we're all supposed to read as in high school. The idea of mythological characters was very alien to these people. The perfect example we can give you, if you watch the 1983 biographical picture of Wagner, it's this really long and not very good movie, but it stars Richard Burton as Wagner, right? There's a scene where he's doing a dramatic reading of the libretto of the Ring Cycle, the poem, as he called it. Remember, it's the poem of the Ring Cycle, where they get to the scene with the Norns. And the Norns, they're these mythological creatures who weave the rope of fate that tells you what has happened and what will happen in the future. And you see these Germans sitting around listening to them talk about Norns. The what? The Norns? What the hell is he talking about, Norns? It makes no sense at all. He's crazy. And watching that scene, it reminds me, being a child of the 1980s, of trying to explain Star Wars to my grandparents. And my grandparents were all very sophisticated people. But when I tried to tell them about the Force and Jabba the Hutt and Jawas and Sand People and Yoda or whatever, they would look at me with like utter incomprehension. Like they had absolutely no idea what I was talking about, right? And rightly so. And then I of course ran into the same problem with Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. I was a little bit too old for that, I think. I know they're universal in appeal, but when my students would try to tell me about the Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, I would just look at them with complete confusion. But nevertheless, all of these mythological structures, these mythological works have an enormous amount in common. In fact, to tell you how close this is, George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, was contracted by the Los Angeles Opera to do a production of The Ring of the Nibelung, with the effects to be supplied by his company, Industrial Light and Magic. What happened with that was that they ran out of money. So instead you got Achim Fryer and his completely, I think Ken, I see Ken laughing. He's like uproariously laughing. It was, I understand, I didn't go, but a lousy production. And wasn't it set sort of in outer space, I think, still. So you got a kind of Lucas concept without Lucas, which had artistic limitations. But a lot of what we do, these mythological structures that we have today, these tales of good and evil, of fundamental moral choices, of struggle between generations, of the seduction by ultimate power, these all feature very much in our culture today. And when Roger says we live in an anti-heroic age, I think that's true in academia. And Roger did function for much of his life in academic environments. Yes, in academia, they despise the concept of heroes. Heroes are to be deconstructed. Heroes are to be sort of dissected in a search for flaws that you can use to expose them as something less than heroic. I think for the vast majority of our society, we still very much live in a heroic age, and we very much live in a romantic age. And if I can digress for just a moment, I do think that's the problem of contemporary classical music. That we have a large number of active composers working in all different genres. They're hideously unpopular, and they wonder why. Usually it's because they're working in a post-romantic idiom and trying to sell that to a romantic society, right? We still want the happy end. We still want the good guy to win. We still want the hero to lead us in the right direction. Look at all these movies we have based on Marvel comics now, right? It's a huge phenomenon, and it speaks very much to people in a distressed society such as ours, especially if you've been around for the past year or so. We live in a very distressed society that needs heroes fundamentally. And the greatness of myth is that it helps you move in that direction. Now, I think Roger does a very good job with the philosophy of this. We can touch on the philosophical tropes. It's very hard, I think, to trace which elements of what philosophers appear in Wagner, and describing them in these philosophical terms, it's often an academic task. First of all, you're trying to hit a moving target. Right? Wagner started writing The Ring of the Nibelung started writing the poem of it, as he called it, in 1848. And he proceeded to work on it with varying degrees of intensity, at times leaving it aside and so on, until he finished the composition in 1873. So that's 25 years. And it took another 3 years before we had the first full performances of the Ring Cycle. Das Rheingold and die Walküre had appeared at earlier times in 1869 and 1870, respectively. Those were their premiere years. But you're talking about a 28-year process of creativity. So he starts at the age of about 34 and continues until he's 63. If you worked on anything in your life during those years, these mid-years of your adult life, of course it would change in substance, in inspiration, in conception over time. And for Wagner, we very much see that going forward. It's fun and interesting to pick out the individual strands of thought. What comes from Feuerbach, what comes from Fichte, what comes from Hegel, what comes from Kant. But you're dealing with an academic exercise. So too are your interpretations. And if you look at a lot of the interpretive analyses of The Ring, yes, they're fascinating, they're fun to read and think about. But if you can do a Jungian analysis of Wagner like Robert Donington did in the 1960s, and there was actually a feminist critique, a Jungian feminist critique that came out a few years ago. So it's actually been done twice. In my opinion, all you've really done is prove to the world that you have enough brains and free time to write a Jungian analysis of Wagner. Well, congratulations, but what does that really do for anybody but you? Nothing, right? It's not to say you shouldn't read it. I think the Jungian archetype explanations are interesting, but not more. Right? How does it deal with your relatability? So too is tracing these philosophical terms. And you can look in terms of Wagner's life and biography. As a young man, he was very much involved in revolutionary causes. He was actually inciting people to revolution in Dresden in 1849 as part of that revolutionary movement in Europe at the middle of the 19th century. And he got in a lot of trouble. He was exiled from Germany for 11 years. He was subject to immediate arrest if he appeared in any state within the German Confederation. Before you have a national Germany, you have this confederation. So he spent a lot of the time in exile in Switzerland, where he was safe from that sort of political persecution. But at the same time, at that moment, yes, he's very much influenced by Feuerbach. He was friends with the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin. Shaw actually thought Bakunin was the role model for Siegfried, which I think is debatable, but nevertheless, that's a established opinion. As you move forward in time, an older and more bitter Wagner turns to Schopenhauer and Schopenhauer's idea of the renunciation of the will, the only way that you can be genuinely happy in your life, satisfied with your existence, is to renounce your worldly ambitions and to become more of an observer. Now, Schopenhauer's philosophy, as Roger points out quite well, very much aligned with what Wagner was thinking, because Schopenhauer fundamentally believed that music was the most expressive of the arts because it's self-contained, just as Schopenhauer believed we as individuals are self-contained. Music has no intrinsic meaning beyond what it creates in our reactions. And the fundamental tension of The Ring is, how do we as free people move forward in a world where we're dominated by natural constraints? That in itself has massive roots in German philosophy. If you go back to the originator of this, to Immanuel Kant, he would argue that you are a subject, right? You are a self-conscious being, but your understanding of the world and your ability to function within nature is limited by your physicality, by the limits of your intellect, by the limits of what you can understand. I think more recently, this has been borne out by scientific discovery. Do we as humans understand the concept of infinity? Right? What came before the creation of the universe? If there is such a thing as a universe, how could something have preceded it? All these great questions that science has posed to us have philosophical dimensions that go back to the sort of late German Enlightenment. But for Wagner's purposes, the point is, how does a free person function within nature? And as you'll see, or as you will have seen already in Rheingold, and we'll see more of in Valkyrie, which you should watch before our next session, the chief god in the ring of the Nibelung, Wotan, is very bound up by laws that sound depressingly bourgeois. And my whole attitude toward this is, if you have a ring that makes you all powerful, why do you have to pay attention to legal niceties? Why can't you just eliminate your opponents once you have the ring, right? And I think that's too legalistic an understanding. We do have another natural question. Before Wagner had even composed a note of the music of the ring cycle, somebody read, one of his friends, August Leukert, in fact, one of his fellow revolutionaries in Dresden, read the entire poem and said, well, if the ring is returned to the Rhine at the end, why do the gods need to be destroyed? And Wagner's response to him, he wrote this to Wagner in a letter, a very, very honest question. Wagner's response was something like, don't talk to me like a lawyer. If you look at this in a very legal way, it's just not going to make any damn sense. Why does it still make sense? Because we understand as humans what it is to have constraints. And it's often said of Wotan, including by its best performer in recent times, by the bass James Morris, that he's an all too human god, and that this is how you have to understand him and his evolution in existence. And what happens to Wotan eventually, he's constrained by his legalistic determinations, by the treaties that govern the world over which he rules as a god, and he has to renounce his goals and become an observer. And in this, he finds a degree of freedom. We also have this problem with Siegfried, who's meant to be a child of nature. If you follow Wagner's early thought in the ring, and also some of the interpretations that come later, particularly George Bernard Shaw's Perfect Wagnerite, Siegfried is supposed to be a revolutionary who overthrows an old order and lives what Wagner would describe as an artistic life. What do we mean by an artistic life? Well, he's creative of his own reality, his own sense of being. And as he goes forward through his adventures and eventually meets his demise, he comes smack up against the constraints of the world. I think I'd like to end, I've been going on for quite a while, so I think I'd like to end with a discussion of productions. I'm not sure what productions you've all been watching. There are a large number on YouTube. The Metropolitan Opera is a very traditional one, which Roger loved. I'm not sure if he ever saw it, but he certainly loved it. That's on YouTube. But you can also find the Patrice Chéreau ring, which Roger despised. That's also up there. I think Harry Kupfer's is there too. Later on in the book, Roger has some nasty things to say about it. But for Roger's point of view, and again, I think this is another argument he and I would have. He believed in traditional productions. It was one of the reasons why he didn't actually go to the opera that much. He hated seeing these kind of Regie Theater productions produced by European directors who tried to take works out of their traditional times and settings. And Roger's very pessimistic about Wagner production in that way. He's looking at it and saying, well, it's either completely deprived of meaning, or there's some kind of great cynicism that originates within this, and the meaning is destroyed. It's either a parody, or they're making fun of it in some way. The idea is that you can't do this. I think to a degree Roger's right, and we can talk about Wagner particularly, but my general observation, being a working critic over the past 15 years or so, is that there's a recent trend, for example, to take works that show outsized emotion and place them in mental institutions. I haven't seen that done with a Wagner opera. It's been done with, like, Tchaikovsky's The Queen of Spades, Richard Strauss's Die Frau ohne Schatten, Strauss's Salome, a bit with Wagner's Lohengrin and a La Scala production. You could argue that it's in a mental institution. And the idea here is that only a really crazy person could experience these types of extreme feelings. And if you're a living human being who has had anything like passion in your life, you know damn well you don't have to be a mental patient. And the only person who would think so is some crappy director who wants to impose his production concept on you. And you should really pity him for his lack of imagination and whatever dull society he's grown up in. You know, so this is one way of looking at it. I don't agree with Roger that all ring cycles have to be traditional. I think that can get very dull and very repetitive. My personal feeling is that stage productions either have talent or have no talent. right? You can have an extremely talented, extremely well executed traditional production, and you can also have a traditional production that's very bad, that's boring, that's poor. And the same thing for non-traditional productions. You can have non-traditional productions that are extremely interesting and engaging, and non-traditional productions that are stupid and awful. That's not the divide. The divide is whether you have artistic talent or you don't. Unfortunately, many of our directors don't, but some do. And I think you can do it in this way. Roger's real point here, as he explains in that first chapter, is that the ring cycle itself exists between a kind of primordial existence that's not burdened by the march of human history or by subsequent developments of settled civilization, right? That time when our remote ancestors were hunter-gatherers. And remember, we keep hearing about this in the psychology publications. We still have hunter-gatherer brains, right? And we're forced to be in this settled society. So we're between this primordial existence and this more settled existence, where we have things like expectations and social institutions, and in Götterdämmerung, you even start to see like incipient feudalism, right? So for Roger's point of view, that traditional production spells it out best. It's the most intelligible, it's recognizable, it's something that you can relate to if you're steeped in that culture and know that there was this divide. The trouble also with this, though, is that Roger believes the work is timeless. I think he's absolutely right about that. The ring cycle is a completely timeless work. You don't need those settings to do that, but it can't be both. It can't be something that has to be told in the traditional idiom and something that's timeless, right? And we can talk about different production approaches maybe in the discussion or as we go on thinking about the work. When we talk about the story, next week I'll talk about how different scenes get staged in different productions. But for the moment, you have to remember that traditional idea that Roger has, it's appealing to him personally. I don't think it always has to rely on that for meaning. I think the meaning can be taken out of the early part of this. And I think that you can also put that in all sorts of different idioms that are intelligible to people today. So I think I've talked about everything I'd like to talk about. Now, if we could go to the discussion, maybe we have some questions. I don't have the thing up. Fisher, would you?